Okay, so Lynn, tell me, just restate the problem and tell me a little bit about the background, if appropriate.
Sure. So I was working on a product team where we were doing 3 week iterations, and now I'm on a new team where we're doing 2 week iterations, which I'm just kind of learning about some of the cadence and the details of the group, and I found that we tend to push a lot of stories out to the next iteration. Things aren't defined fast enough. I find myself in a lot of meetings, and I don't know if it's because it's just the organizational culture, but a lot of meetings that I feel like maybe if we had gone to a 3 week, we won't have as many meetings.
Hmm.
And then also just kind of wanting to get an idea of how to align that with releases. If a 2 week should align with a release every 2 weeks, or should it be a
Mhm.
monthly? So a lot of question
Sure.
marks on how to improve the process for our team.
Yeah, so, and I'm glad you used the word cadence because it is important that whatever length you choose, that it's a regular length, that your team chooses a length and then gets used to it and gets good at it. And I'll start with the last part of your question, which was about releases. So Scrum and any other agile method, actually, pretty much will say, you don't have to release at the same frequency of your cadence, your iteration or your sprint or your cycle or whatever. The point of the cadence is to make sure that you've got the rhythm for the team and that you have a way of like getting feedback about the product. So in your sprint review, for example, of course, you would demo it, show it to customers, stakeholders, whatever, but you don't necessarily have to release. In fact, many of the best agile teams release far more frequently than once per sprint. As soon as they finish a product backlog item or a user story or a ticket, they will release it. And that is this idea of continuous delivery, which is a very, very powerful thing. It takes a lot of high-end sort of technical skills and some tooling, but this is kind of like the ultimate in sort of customer service, right? Like basically, as soon as you've got some value that's ready to go, you put it out into the production environment, into the marketplace, or whatever. So Scrum, Extreme Programming, Kanban, none of them require you to release in synchronization with your cadences. So it's completely optional.
Should the release also have a cadence, or should it be like whenever you have something that's ready for prod? Just
Well, so in many cases, it's going to depend on your organization and your stakeholders. Many stakeholders like to have a regular release cadence, but if you think about like modern software development, like apps on your phone, for example, like I get updates on here for apps all the time, and I don't notice, right? Like I don't know if Facebook is updating my Facebook app every day, every week, every hour, every month. I don't know. I don't really care because that's the nature of this marketplace, right? Like the apps that you have on your device, it doesn't really matter. But on the other hand, for example, in some regulatory environments, the cadence does matter a lot. And so of course, you just basically decide on your release cadence depending on your environment. Generally speaking, the faster the better because you get faster feedback that way. But again, there's no rule about it.
Yeah.
I think I think in the Agile Manifesto, of course, it talks about like we release frequently in order to help our customers. So as long as it's not more than longer than a couple of months, it's still agile, right? It's only if you start thinking about like quarterly releases or biannual releases or whatever, then it's kind of like, is this really agile? Well, maybe not.
Right. So yeah, I think we have a bit more flexibility because we're not working in scaled and we don't have to align with other teams in terms of releases.
Okay, yeah. So that's a good freedom. That's really
Mhm.
nice. Now, you also had an earlier part to your question, which was about the duration of your cadences, and you said you had been in 3 weeks and then in 2 weeks. For what it's worth, as a coach, I don't know if you heard me say this in the training or not. I don't say it every time, but I almost always recommend 1 week sprints or 1 week iterations. And a
Mhm.
big part of the reason for that is about the kind of good pressure that it puts on a team. So you mentioned in 2 week sprints that you feel like you're spending a lot of time in meetings, right? And that's a kind of pressure. It's like, man, I'm spending all this time in meetings. I feel like I'm not getting as much done as I could get done, or my team isn't. So that's a question for your retrospective. And the question should be not, do we have the right length of sprint? The question should be, how do we solve that pressure so that we're more effective with our meetings, more efficient with our meetings, so there's fewer meetings? Like Scrum defines a few, but different agile methods have different ways of dealing with meetings. And really, in a good self-organizing team, that's a conversation for the team. You as a team member can bring that up and say, hey team, like, is this just a corporate culture? Like, or are there some meetings that we could stop attending or slim down somehow or make them more valuable? Because that's always another possibility, right? Like if you're present together with people, there's also value in that, right? So maybe there's a way to make the existing meetings more valuable. If you think about the Scrum meetings, for example, they're meant to be scaled with the length of your sprint. So if you have a 1 month sprint planning is a whole day. But
Right.
but if you're planning a shorter sprint, like a 2 week sprint, you don't need a whole day to plan a 2 week sprint, or at least you shouldn't. You would cut that down in approximately half. So you might say 3.5 hours or 4 hours for sprint planning in a 2 week sprint. But that's not all, right? Like that's the outer limit. That's like the maximum. But a lot of Scrum teams, once they get good at sprint planning, they often get it down to like an hour and a half, maybe, sometimes even less than that for a whole week. And there's a whole bunch of things that your team can do to get better at sprint planning. A really simple example is that for historical reasons, a lot of Scrum teams try and do a complete task breakdown and then volunteer for all of the tasks in the sprint planning meeting. Do you guys do that?
Yeah, so the Scrum Master will call out the PBIs and the team will kind of grab the task that they want to work on. And then, the Scrum Master will kind of take a look at the end of the meeting. Oh, hey, you've taken too many story points. Maybe someone else could take it. So it's really on the team to grab the story.
You said something interesting there about what the Scrum Master is doing. I'll come back to that in a moment. But one of the things that's kind of a good practice for teams is to stop allocating all the work. So in sprint planning, what really should happen is that each team member chooses the first thing they're going to work on, but nothing else. And then when they finish that first thing in the middle of the sprint somewhere, then they go look at what's left and then they choose another thing. But generally speaking, deciding who's going to do what and how many story points and stuff like that in sprint planning is actually not a good practice. It diminishes self-organizing, it diminishes teamwork, it almost never works out, right? Like you mentioned that a lot of times user stories are getting pushed off into future sprints. Well, I'll tell you, that's this behavior of choosing things and allocating all the work at the start of the sprint and sprint planning. That's one of the reasons that you're having stories pushed out into future sprints. So one way to think of this, and again, this is about how do you make your sprint planning meeting shorter and at the same time make your sprint more effective, right? Because really what we don't care whether our meetings are long or short. Really, what we care about is being effective, delivering value, right? One thing that I find that works really well in a lot of teams is for the whole team to choose one or maybe two product backlog items that they're going to start working on in the sprint. And that the whole team swarms those backlog items. Everyone works on them together until they're done, which is very quickly usually if you have the whole team just working on one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then move to the next one. Like, so it's kind of like in the middle of your sprint, or along the way in the sprint, you're going to have these little mini volunteering sessions. You can do them as part of your daily Scrum, or they can just be ad hoc. But by getting one user story done at a time for your team, it actually means that you usually end up having everything done by the end of the sprint, and you don't have as much rolling over into future sprints. And the reason for that is actually, it's very simply about the efficiency of focus. Like one of the Scrum values is focus. And when you have all the minds of your team focused on a single problem at a time, problem solving is way faster. The work division between people is much more effective. And, if people are idle, there's a lot more pressure on everyone else to work quickly. There's also long-term effects, like it helps with long-term cross-training within your team for people to be working together.